Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. My name's Julian Huppard, and I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum. We were set up in 2016 to try to get people to think and talk about some of the biggest issues of our time. And we've done many of those through our time here. And it's great to be in this wonderful location. I know some of you will have been many times to Jesus College. It's always great to have the Master of Jesus. Isn't that a wonderful title here? But originally this was a 12th century nunnery. In 1144, a small group of itinerant nuns were given a little plot of land here. They then benefited very significantly from a gift by the King of Scotland, who gave the revenues from all the land around here to the nunnery. You may wonder why the King of Scotland was owning land around here, but that's another conversation and perhaps brings us on to international affairs, which we'll pick up later today. The college has continued to develop. It became a college in 1496. All the women were kicked out, a problem we have now fixed. And we've had some amazing people who have thought about how to change the world, how to think differently. We've had people like Cranmer, who reshaped the Church of England. We've had people like Thomas Malthus, who was here, who thought a lot about how the international order should work and how populations should be controlled. More recently, we've had people like Lisa Jardine and Clean Bandit, for those of you who know Rockabye. I hope there's a few people smiling at least. So there is a very long history. When I say that we talk about some of the biggest issues of our time, I really do mean it. And so just this last couple of weeks in a term, we started off by talking about one of the key issues, humour. What it is, how we think about it. We then last week looked at writing, and we had an amazing Anglo-German author, Sharon Duda-Otto, who's one of our visiting fellows here at the college. And tonight it's a great pleasure to invite another of our visiting fellows to come here to talk about perhaps one of the key issues of our time, about the international order, peace, and how we make that work. We didn't schedule this carefully, knowing what was going to happen in the world, and I hope it is completely coincidental. We're going to have it in conversation. I'm not going to say too much about Philippe. You will, of course, know about him. A brilliant world-leading international lawyer who has arbitrated many cases, campaigned on many others, and the best-selling author of, I think, 17 books, one of which has sold almost 1 million copies. So if you can buy another copy or two, it will take it over that million threshold. Philippe, it's fantastic to have you with us. Please do come and join us.
Thank you.
So we're going to have a conversation for a bit, and I have a few prepared questions, at least while you get the water out. And then there will be a chance for all of you to ask questions, whether you are sitting here in this amazing Frankopan Hall, or for those of you who are online. Hello, we've had people from well over 100 countries come to our event, so it may be bumping up slightly even as I speak. Philippe, before we talk about you as a lawyer, can we start off with you as a child? What were you like as a child? What interested you? What got you going? How did your family fit in?
Well, where to begin? It's a long story, and some people here know it a little bit, so I have to be very careful what I say. I don't think I had a very happy childhood. My dad was a dentist. My mum ran a small bookshop which sold children's books. I had no contact with the law at all. The first time I ever met a lawyer was when I came to university. I think I'd say that the defining episode of my childhood was in May 1971. One of my dad's patients was called Charlie George, and Charlie George scored the winning goal in the 1971 FA Cup final against Liverpool, which Arsenal won 2-1, and it was as though my dad had scored the winning goal in the FA Cup. When you're 10 years old, that is really a big thing. Charlie George, more than 50 years later, is a good friend of mine, and I think he was an introduction to another world, and it was a very happy childhood.
But an introduction to a different world, but disputes between Liverpool and Arsenal aren't the same as international law disputes, unless I'm missing something about how the game's going.
Well, you just discovered this evening, we had dinner beforehand, and I shared with Julian that one of the things that I got appointed to, it's really strange what you get appointed to as an international lawyer. But about 10 years ago, I was asked to apply for the position as a judge on the International Court of Arbitration for Sport. And it doesn't really have much to do with international law. It was a very long form, and there were 2 whole pages which said, use the space to fill out your relationship with sport or sport and the law. And I had no relationship at all with sport and the law. I filled in the form, sent it off, and was amazed to be appointed. And in the context of that appointment, I have sat every year now for 10, 12 years on a whole raft of unbelievable cases. And what's totally different from the sports cases than from my day job type of work on international law is it deals with the minutiae of individual people's lives, which we all know is a fascinating subject. Daily life is fantastic and fascinating. And in this function, you get to understand that nothing is what it seems. I mean, the sports that I've had, of course, include the major sports. I sat on the Lance Armstrong case in terms of cycling, and various football disputes and various disputes that have led to armed conflict between countries. But the really great cases have been about backgammon, tiddlywinks. I have had a case. It is recognised as a sport under international law. And that has been significant because it's introduced me to another world, the world of a community of sports people who are operating at the highest level, and it's a remarkable community.
It isn't. One of our other visiting fellows just recently appointed is Chris Boardman, the Olympic cyclist, who has, I think, won as many Tour de France as Lance Armstrong has now, at 0 each. But yes, it is an amazing group. But just to rewind, so how does this young child who'd never really met a lawyer, a football fan as you still are, why did you apply to do law in the first place?
I didn't. Do you want to know
So
more?
what went wrong?
No,
Right.
I applied to do economics, and unbelievably, I got in to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. Actually, to go back even slightly further, I didn't want to come to Cambridge. I had no interest in coming to Cambridge. I wanted to go to Bristol. Really, really, really wanted to go to Bristol. And I don't know why I wanted to go to Bristol. Maybe my friends had gone to Bristol or something like that. But I didn't get into Bristol. So I took a year off. And then in those days, you could do something called 7th term entry, where you stayed on for an extra term at school. And we'd had this fantastic economics and politics teacher. He was actually called Edmund Burke. And he said, no, you should apply for economics. That's definitely what you should do. And so I applied for economics. I chose my college because what we did in those days, where you had no background and weren't particularly brilliant or anything, was you'd find the college that had the least number of applicants per place in the chosen subject. And it worked. And I got in to do economics, but after 6 weeks I changed. And the reason that I changed was that Ed Burke's lessons had just been far superior to what we got in our first few weeks. But Ed Burke really changed my life. I think every person should have the joy of having one fantastic teacher. That's just all you need. And Ed Burke, when we were 15, a bunch of boys from North London decided we needed to learn how the world really was. And so he got the school bus, bunged us in the school bus, and he drove us up. I remember him, up to Yorkshire, where he was from, and made us go down a coal mine. And that was a life-changing experience because we had no idea how people worked and lived. And that's why I wanted to do economics. And I got in to do economics and was bored, and so changed to law. And as I've already said, I think, to be honest, it was the worst decision I made. A terrible decision, because law was incredibly boring. You just had to learn these rules. I've got law academics here, and I hate to say this, I'm sure Cambridge has changed dramatically since 1979 when I turned up. But it was just about learning the rules. There wasn't any discussion about anything. You were just expected to churn out essays just saying what the rules were and this kind of stuff. The only course that I loved was taught by someone who's from Jesus College, Cambridge. And he was a wonderful person who was the professor of international law. We called him Robbie Jennings. He had huge bushy eyebrows. We loved his eyebrows. And he went on to become the British judge at the International Court, and he changed my world with his lectures. They were fantastic, and they seemed connected to my life. And the reason they seemed connected to my life was that my mum was a child refugee. And so all of a sudden, a subject was opened up that seemed somehow connected to experience at home, and then I was off.
It says something about a law course that international law is the bit that feels most homely.
Well, it either says something about a law course or it says something about the individual's life. But all these, I mean, actually, it was sort of a shame. In our first year, I don't know how it is now, but we had to do Roman law. So,
still do that.
so you're 18 years old, and you have to do Roman law, and you're thinking, what has this got to do with anything? And now I've come to realize the brilliance of Roman law. But an 18-year-old should not be subjected to Roman law. You should do that when you're 23, 24, and you've begun to understand all about life. That's when the law becomes interesting, when you realize how it connects to the human experience. And at 18, I don't think you know anything. And so we had a wonderful Roman law teacher, David Ibbotson, and I wish we'd had him 5 or 6 years later. I just think at 18, you should be doing what you love, not what's going to get you a job in 4 years' time.
So you were captivated by international law,
Yeah.
finished the degree, and then?
Well, I stayed on. I did a master's in international law here, Cambridge. I was absolutely shocked. Over dinner to be told that the LLM in international law now costs £48,000 a year to do, which seems utterly incredible. It may be a bit less than that, but in my day, Camden Council paid for it. It was, 1,500 quid a year, and we didn't come from a wealthy family, and that was quite a lot of money, and Camden Council would pay for it, and that is how it ought to be, frankly, because it means people from all sorts of different backgrounds can get to do things. So I did this master's. I had absolutely wonderful teachers, although, and maybe just to put down a marker for what is going to come later, I didn't realize, well, I thought, because I did international law at Cambridge and we were told it was the best university in the whole world, etc., I assumed international law was made by, invented by, run by, reflected the values of white men of a certain age who spoke with English accents. And the entirety of our course, and I loved the course, they were brilliant teachers, but of course, only when you got out into the world later on did you realize that actually the world of international law is totally different from what these wonderful teachers taught us at university, and that was a big experience. Amongst the teachers was a man called Eli Lauterpacht, who was a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He taught some of our classes. I didn't get to know him pretty well. After my LLM was over, I basically lied to my parents about the need to go off to America on some other activity, but in fact, I just wanted to go and live with my then girlfriend, who was an American who was a Marshall Scholar here in Britain and was going back to America, and I just wanted to be with her for a year. And I was explaining to the young law undergrads here that no, I didn't have anything to do there. I arrived literally without a single penny, and I wandered into Harvard Law School, met some people in due course, Dr. Stephanie Palmer sitting opposite me, that was quite a long time ago, Stephanie, and found a young academic who needed someone to do his footnotes, David Kennedy. And David Kennedy offered me $8 an hour to do footnotes for him for 10 hours a week. And that was like, wow, manna from heaven. That was incredible. And the world opened up. And while I was there, living above the Grolier Poetry Bookshop on Plimpton Street, which is still there 40 years later, out of the blue came a letter from Ellie Lauterpacht saying, would you like to apply for position as a research fellow at St. Catherine's and be associated with a new research centre for international law that I'm going to set up? Still to this day, I don't really know why he wrote to me, but as you will see later on in life, there was an extraordinary connection that I had with Ellie Lauterpacht, but we didn't learn about it for another 33 years.
I mean, should we jump to that connection?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's, you're clearly raring to talk about it. How did you find the connection with?
Well, Ellie did hire me, which was wonderful. For the younger ones amongst you, you'll be interested to know that my starting salary was £1,000 a quarter. And I got a room also, and I loved it, and I was there for 4 years, and it got my academic career up and running, and Ellie insisted I must also qualify as a barrister, because otherwise you'd be a completely useless, wasted individual, and you had to do that, so I did that, because that's what he said you had to do. And then my life went the direction that it did, and after about 30 years, I got an invitation to give a lecture at the University of Lviv in Ukraine, which I didn't even know where it was when I got the invitation, and would I come and give a lecture on the cases that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide? And I said yes, because I'd worked out by then through Google that Lviv was Lemberg, and Lemberg was where my grandfather was born. And I thought, wow, okay, that'll be really interesting to go and see if I can find the house where my grandfather was born, because that was about my own identity, his identity. He never talked about anything that happened before the war, before 1945, and so we knew nothing about it. I thought he was Austrian. I thought Lemberg was in Austria. Well, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so I went off there, and in preparing the lecture, I made the completely accidental discovery, for which I can't get any credit, I think, that the man who invented the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, had studied at that law school that had invited me, and they didn't know it. And then that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity, Hirsch Lauterpacht, Ellie's father, had studied at that law school, and they didn't know it. So I sort of arrived and said, hey, amazing, you invite me to give this lecture on crimes against humanity and genocide. And it started right here in this law school in Ukraine. And that then caused me to start research on writing a book, which became East-West Street. And in the course of writing the book, I went to the village outside Lviv where Hirsch Lauterpacht was born in 1897, and astonishingly discovered that he was born on the very same street as my great-grandmother. It's a town of 5,000 people. I mean, you couldn't invent it. A street called Lemberger Straße, but which the great writer Joseph Roth called East-West Street, and hence the title of the book. And so I remember going to see Ellie in 2013 and saying to him, Ellie, you are not going to believe this. He had hired me in 1984, and 30 years later, I tell him we have origins that go to the very same street of this Ukrainian town. So it made me wonder why things happen, and Natalia, my wife, and I have very different views about this, and we discuss this very actively. I think they happen for reasons that are to do with forms of communication that we don't fully understand, that in some way Ellie and I had communicated over years, not by verbalized means, but that there was a connection. My wife thinks that's total bullshit, and it's just a complete coincidence. And if I were to ask here, is there anyone who's got antecedents in Lemberg, at least 5 people will put their hands up, and you'll be my grandfather or something like that. But it raises this question of how extraordinary things like this can happen. I mean, how was it that I happened to be the one who chanced across this story when I wasn't looking for it? I didn't have an instinct, I didn't have a thesis, I just accepted an invitation. So how did I get the invitation? How did that happen? At the very least, it causes us to ask questions about how things like this happen.
Absolutely, and fortune favours a prepared mind. You of course don't know about the coincidences that went. weren't explored. There are so many things that you've been involved in that we could spend all night talking about different ones. Before we go sort of to the more recent, more famous ones, for your early days when you were just starting out, were there any that really stood out?
1990, Geneva, Second World Climate Conference. My friend James Cameron and I had set up an environmental NGO. While I was in Cambridge in 1986, on the 26th of April, the Chernobyl accident happened. And via Ellie Lauterpacht, I got an invitation to give a paper in Washington. This was pretty exciting, to be asked to go to Washington and write an academic paper on the legal consequences of Chernobyl. And of course, we didn't know what they were at the time because we didn't really know what had happened. And there was no such thing as international environmental law. But one thing led to another. I went to Washington. I met these kooky but rather wonderful characters who practice in an area called environmental law, which we'd never heard of in England. No one had ever taught this subject. It literally was untaught. And one thing led to another, and we created a public interest Centre for International Environmental Law, and we needed money, and we made an application to the Ford Foundation, and we were astonished to be given $250,000 to provide legal advice to the smallest countries in the world in the negotiations of what became the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which meant we had to go to the first meeting. And it was the first time I'd been to an intergovernmental meeting on the delegation of a country, which was marvelous because when you're on a formal delegation, you can go everywhere. You can go into every room and see everyone, and Margaret Thatcher is standing there, and you can shake her hand and chat with her. And it was just before she left office. And I won't forget, I'm not a supporter of that sort of direction, but I have to say, I've never forgotten the speech that she gave in 1990 on climate change, 33 years ago. She was a chemist. She knew exactly what she was talking about. And compared to these muppets we have now who are governing us, she really had an understanding. And what she said then has absolutely come true, as we have all seen and what we are living through right now as temperatures go up. And I have not forgotten that moment. Sitting behind, I remember right in front of me was Chris Patton. Remember him? Sitting right in front of me.
Now, you've taken, because you were representing another country, which delegation were you?
I was on the delegation of Solomon Islands, with which I've maintained a very close relationship. Not that close, but close.
Because we were talking earlier in the student event about the fact that you've taken on a lot of cases against the UK, your home country, and that's completely acceptable.
Yeah, it's a really fantastic thing about Britain. That I think it's probably the only country in the world where when you've been to an international court against your own country, won and humiliated them completely, they still celebrate you. And that is special. I mean, it's slightly said in jest, but how many other countries have the openness of mind and spirit to recognize that a member of their legal community, a barrister, in exercise of an independent profession, can be retained by another country to sue the United Kingdom in international court, and that is not held against you? I feel very proud of that. And we were discussing it before at the student event. It's an openness of spirit, which is, I think, right now under threat with things like enemies of the people and lefty lawyers and this kind of thing, which is a new development just in the last 5 years. But I think generally most people in this country are passionate believers in and supporters of the idea that when you as a member of the bar act for a particular person or company or state, you're not expressing your own views. You're fulfilling a professional obligation and acting with independence and integrity. It's not anti-British to act against the United Kingdom. In fact, it's the very opposite.
Yeah. So we could pick out one of those cases, which was the Chagos Islands case. Do you want to say a bit about how you got involved with that, how it developed? Some people I'm sure will know it extremely well, some may not.
The Chagos Archipelago, who here has heard of the Chagos Archipelago? Okay, so that's pretty good. So the Chagos Archipelago, 58 tiny islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, attached for 150 years as part of the British colony of Mauritius, separated from Mauritius in 1965 by order in council in order to give one of the islands to the Americans as a military base, Diego Garcia, and then 5 years later, the entire population forcibly removed to Mauritius and Seychelles. And for 4 decades, Mauritius has wanted their islands back. In 2010, I was on holiday with my brother. Actually, we went skiing with our kids, which is what we do, sort of boys' holiday with your kids, because neither of our partners like skiing, but we went. And I remember the moment very, very well, because I was on a chairlift, sort of about 100 meters above the ground, and my phone rang, and I'm very terrified of dropping my telephone, and losing it in the snow. But it was a number, and I thought, +230, what's that? I was so curious that I picked it up, and the person there said, Prime Minister's Office, Mauritius. Yeah. What I'm proudest of that phone call is that as I saw the end of the chairlift approaching, I did manage to glide off beautifully without falling over. And she said, he wants to speak to you right now. He's got something very urgent to say. And one thing led to another. And it was, would you create a legal team to help us recover our islands from the British government? And I didn't know what the Chagos Archipelago was. And I felt, he said, you'll have heard of Diego Garcia. And I had heard of Diego Garcia because the bombing of Iraq started in 2003 from Diego Garcia, and there'd been an American act of extraordinary rendition where planes had stopped at Diego Garcia. So that had all been in the papers, but I didn't know. Chagos I didn't know. And in fact, as I write in the book, The Last Colony, which was published a year or so ago, I felt embarrassed that I didn't know. I didn't know that the British government had so recently forcibly deported 2,000 human beings who were all black, all descended from enslaved people. And how could it be that I knew nothing about this? How could it be? How had I missed this? Why hadn't we been taught about, we were taught empire was long ago and the colonies were long ago. I went, and I describe in the book, going to find, because I'm not a refugee, but my mum was, but I said, you sort of keep everything, you don't throw anything away. And so I had my school history book from the early 1970s. Some of you may remember Geoffrey Treece, This Is Your Century. There's a few nods around, yeah. Well, go and read chapter 16, Sunset on Empire. It's a complete shocker. It is disgraceful. And that's the stuff that we were fed. It begins with an account of this fabulous, elegant, tall, hat-wearing character, Viscount Mountbatten, who was the last person to run India properly, replaced by the current incumbent. The book had been written a little bit earlier. I think it was published in the mid-60s, but we had it in 73. Replaced by, and I apologize for what I'm about to say, but I'm literally quoting from the book, a fellow who is short, pacifist, vegan, and looks a bit like a monkey wearing glasses. Yes, that is in the book. I read that and I thought, oh my God, this is really shocking. And that's why people from my generation have never thought about these issues, because we were just fed all this stuff about how brilliant Britain was. And Britain did lots of good things, but it also did some terrible things. And we were never told about those terrible things. And it's only through entry into life, in my case, coming across these situations. And so I took on the case, and the case went all the way up to the World Court, and Mauritius won, and the United Kingdom was ordered to leave the Chagos Archipelago. And it's a very interesting experience to be on the delegation of an African country for now 15 years nearly, and see how the British treat people who come from small African countries. And it's not a good feeling, I can tell you. It's essentially, the country hasn't really changed in terms of its attitude to its former colonies. And you see that in all sorts of different ways. Ironically, at a certain moment, I'd asked the Prime Minister, why did he come to me? And this was, again, it was really interesting. He said, because you wrote a book. In 2005, he said, he wrote a book called Lawless World, which revealed the circumstances in which the United Kingdom went to war in Iraq on the basis of a lie. And the lie was reflected in a legal opinion written by the then Attorney General that it was lawful to go to war. And interestingly, and I won't mention any names, there is at least one master of a Cambridge college who is extremely closely connected to the facts of that case. But we shall say no more because we're courteous and British and polite. But he said it was that book. He wanted to find, it comes back to the question before, a British person who would act against the United Kingdom. And in fact, there are many British people who would act against the United Kingdom. The entire community of the English bar would be happy to do that, or be willing to do that, because that's our rules of conduct and that's how we do it. But it was interesting for me. I'd worried in writing that book, which was published in 2005, that it would be the end of my litigating career, that it would be seen as such a terrible thing to have revealed these confidential legal opinions. But it's had completely the opposite effect in terms of people generally, or some people out there, have some respect for expressions of independent opinion that are backed up by evidence and facts and supported. And it's been an interesting experience.
There are lots of things we could talk about. There's a few I just want to make sure we pick up on before we open up to wider questions. One was in the title of this talk, and we thought was going to be the major geopolitical issue when we actually had the talk, which is Ukraine and the law around what's happening with the invasion of Ukraine. You've commented on this.
Well, because of my connection with Ukraine through going to Lviv, and I've been probably 20 times to Ukraine in the last 13, 14 years. I've got many very good friends in Ukraine. And because of East-West Street, which has been read by a lot of people, including President Zelensky and Mr. Kuleba, the foreign minister, I was amazed. 2 days after the war began, I got a request from the Financial Times to write an op-ed piece, and I've done a few. I like writing for the Financial Times. It's read very wide. It's really interesting. You get a sense of who reads it. You get wonderful letters back and comments back. A lot of people who disagree with you, but do it in a very interesting and substantive way, which is like in an academic community. It's good. And they said, would you write 700 words on Ukraine and international law, apropos the invasion? So I thought about it for a few hours, and then I wrote my 700 words just in a couple of hours once I knew what I wanted to write. And it was about a gap in the architecture of the international order. So there are 4 international crimes. War crimes, as a concept, you can't target civilians, very significant right now as we're speaking. That dates back to the 19th century. Then the 2 crimes invented in 1945 for the Nuremberg trial, crimes against humanity, protection of individuals, genocide, protection of groups, and the 4th crime invented for Nuremberg was then called crimes against peace, today the crime of aggression, the waging of an illegal war. And the International Criminal Court in The Hague has jurisdiction over the first 3 crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. But it doesn't have jurisdiction for various complex political and technical legal reasons over the crime of aggression. Basically, the big powers didn't want to give an international court the power to determine that they or individuals associated with those countries had violated international law and entered criminality by going to war illegally. You can see the reasons why there'd be nervousness. about that. So I thought I'll write about that, and I proposed the creation of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression. And the reason that I focused on that was that it worried me that in 5 years' time we would find a situation in which some pretty low-grade Russian military or paramilitaries were hauled up before the International Criminal Court, but the people on the top table would be off scot-free, because it's very difficult to pin a war crime or a crime against humanity on the leadership. The proof is tough. I know that from doing lots of cases. So the crime of aggression is straightforward. Putin had said, I'm going to invade them, and there's no justification for it. We all knew that. And it would be the way to focus on him. No international tribunal for the crime of aggression has been established since Nuremberg. So it hasn't happened in 75 years. So, you write these 700 words, you think, oh, well, it's the right thing to do, but of course, 8 people and a dog will write to me over the next 2 days and say bravo or terrible or whatever, and then you go on to the next thing. That is not what happened. The next thing that happened was there were hundreds of emails within 24 hours. It was really bizarre. And the emails didn't just come, they came from regular folk and regular readers, but they came from a lot of presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, one former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who I didn't know, and from the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, who said, oh, this is a great idea. And what's sort of uplifting about that is the very notion that ideas matter, that you can write an article and a newspaper that's a decent newspaper runs it, and actually something happens. And the next thing that happened is it became Ukrainian government policy within a matter of a week. And the next thing that happened after that is all these Central European countries said, oh yeah, we're on for that, let's go for it. And then, should we say, there was a bit of reluctance from the Western great powers, who were not exactly thrilled about the idea that if you can create a special tribunal for one permanent member of the Security Council today, why can't you create one for another one tomorrow? So they have finally come along. France sort of broke the deadlock. And right now, where we stand 15 months on or so, is that there is agreement to create a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression in relation to Ukraine, but a deadlock over what sort of tribunal. So Ukraine and its closest partners, all the Baltics, Poland, and countries who are on the front line, if you like, want a full-on international criminal tribunal like Nuremberg. Britain, France, the United States, and then Germany, because the Germans will just do whatever the Americans do. We sort of want a special criminal tribunal, but not a full-on one. Let's just take a Ukrainian tribunal and let's situate it in The Hague. They call it a hybrid international tribunal. And so we're right now in a sort of deadlock with a next stage of discussion to take place on the 16th of November in Berlin, in which the German foreign minister has just told us she wants to break the deadlock and find a middle ground, a sort of bridge between the two ideas. And so the intellectual challenge, which a group of us is trying to work on right now, is how do you create that middle ground that allows Ukraine to say it's got what it wants and allows the Brits, the French, and the Americans to say, we're protected, there's no precedent, this is, next time we invade Iraq, we're going to be quite fine, no one's going to haul us off to an international court. And that's the political reality of how these things get done.
Just briefly before we move on, let's say you resolve this.
It will be resolved.
What are the chances that Putin or somebody in senior Russian leadership ever comes before it?
I think we don't know. I think it's probably unlikely, but if you go back in time to 1942, when Charles de Gaulle made his statement at St. James's Palace on the 13th of January and said, I want to prosecute the senior Nazis, everyone said, terrific, but it's a hopeless idea, it'll never happen. And 3 years later, and then in 93, it happened again with Yugoslavia, and Milosevic, and Karadzic, and Mladic, and everyone said, we want to prosecute these guys, yeah, well, let's set up a tribunal, but we'll never get them. And it happened, Charles Taylor in Liberia. So it seems improbable But the reality is you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think in those circumstances, you do the right thing, you create it, and then you see where the chips fall.
So moving on slightly, the last week has been rather dominated by another part of the world. We've all been horrified by what's happening in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Hamas's brutal aggression, and everything that's followed from that. Now, you obviously have a number of involvements around the conflicts we were discussing earlier. Obviously, there's a certain amount of fog of war about many of the details, but what are the principles? What are the laws that ought to be applying?
So personally, this is a very difficult, painful, and complicated situation for me. Why? Because on the one hand, I've got family in Israel, I've got friends in Israel, I'm Jewish. On the other hand, again, in exercise of my independent legal profession, right now I'm counsel for Palestine in a case before the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the settlements. So not for Hamas, I would say. I would not have accepted the brief for Hamas, but for the Palestinian Authority, who find themselves in an incredibly difficult position because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. But they have put out statements basically articulating the position that the targeting of any civilians in any circumstances is unlawful, prohibited, and to be condemned. And that is the right position to take. So I have to say that I found the accounts and the images which I've stopped looking at of what happened in that weekend very triggering and very painful, because it looks to me very much like the images of what happened when an Einsatzgruppen troop in 1941 entered a village and decided to do what they did. And it has really, I found it very, very difficult, actually. I mean, that was a level of brutality and barbarism. Just, we've seen the accounts, we've read the accounts, we know the veracity of what happened, there's no question. I had a very painful conversation this morning with a good friend of mine, a barrister, who said to me, yeah, but weren't all those people who were at the dance and the rave caught in the crossfire? I said, no. They were lined up and they were executed. 260 people, that was not caught in the crossfire. In a single room they were taken and they were shot. You know, kids, basically. And I know the parents of some of those kids. And so it's very painful and very, very personal. On the other hand, the response, and Israel is entitled to act in self-defense, no question. But its exercise of the right of self-defense must comply with the rules. And the rules are, you cannot target civilians, you have to respond proportionately, and you have to exercise real restraint in how you respond. And Israel is subject to those rules. However horrific what has happened is, there is no justification for siege. There is no justification for evacuating half the population of Gaza and telling them to get out. There is no justification for razing northern Gaza to the ground. There's no ifs and buts about it. The complexity is that very few people want to say that in this country right now, but it needs to be said. And of course, the moment you stick your head above the parapet and say that, you're going to be accused of being anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-this. And so the answer to your question is, you've just got to stick to the rules. And the job for people like me, and frankly, it's much easier to do it as a little group of people because there's a sort of safety in numbers thing. So we have spent the last 3 or 4 days trying to get together that little group of people who are willing to stick their head above the parapets and say, what Hamas did was barbaric, appalling, and criminal, but what Israel maybe already is doing, but certainly what its intentions are, may also be barbaric, criminal, and appalling. So there's one document in all the writing of these books, East-West and The Rat Line, that I keep coming back to. And it's a fantastic telex that I first came across when I wrote Lawless World in 2005 by an American diplomat called George Kennan. And some of you with a historical background will remember he signed it anonymously X, and he was posted to Moscow, and he was warning the State Department in Washington about the dangers of communism for Western Europe. But he said in that telex, the greatest danger we face is that we shall become like those who seek to destroy us. And I think that, for me, has just been the guiding principle. After 9/11, and I was in New York on 9/11, where we just got the response completely wrong, because we didn't stick to that fundamental principle. We tortured people, we bombed people, we went off on an illegal war, and we're paying the price for all of that today. It's very tough for a leader to exercise restraint. I completely understand that in the face of the images. I mean, 1,300 people murdered, executed. For a leader to exercise restraint in those conditions is tough. But that's what you've got to do.
One final piece from me, and then we'll go to the audience. We've had many interesting speakers on some of these issues. One a few years ago was Michael Mandelbaum, who's a US foreign policy expert who has a book, The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth. And his take is that there was a 25-year period of peace from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's now over. Are you optimistic for the future? Are you
Hugely
pessimistic
optimistic.
for the future?
Yeah.
Why? What gives you cause for hope?
I'll tell you why. Because it's a long game. This is just the beginning of, in terms of the international order, it was basically created in its modern form in 1945. It was 75 years ago. It's nothing. And one of the big influences that I had when I was a young research fellow coming back to that early period is a wonderful academic at St. Catherine's, a professor of English legal history, John Baker. And again, apologies to the student because I mentioned this anecdote. It really marked me. I was 24, 25, and a young research fellow at CATS, and he would sometimes very generously say, come and have lunch, tell me what you're up to. And I would tell him what I was up to, and he'd sort of say, oh, yes. Yes, we had a similar problem in English law in 1437. and it took 263 years to sort it out. And he's right. We're just at that stage where we're finding our way. There was mayhem and violence in 1437 in Britain that was probably indistinguishable from what's going on now, except it's just on a bigger scale. And so the optimism is that if you go through the exercise of situating yourself in 1437 and then seeing what may come, of course you're optimistic. It will get better. There are ups and there are downs, and there's a step forward and a step sideways, another step forward and then a step back. And this is a really bad moment, and there is a sense that the combination of Ukraine, and maybe China and Taiwan, and Israel and Palestine, and then put on top of it climate change, which I think is really serious, it all seems a bit overwhelming. And yet somehow, I think that we will find a way, not before a lot of people go through horrible things, but we will find a way in the longer term.
On that optimistic note, can I invite questions from the audience? If you could wait for the microphones to arrive. If you're online, there's a Q&A feature, and if you put something there, I will be able to put it there. Who would like to start us off? There's a question at the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I have a question which relates to sort of the things you talked about the last 5 and 10 minutes, but then perhaps a bit more of a technical question. Forgive the nature of it, but I'm a historian of a legal historian of international law. Where do you see international law heading? Because if I interpret your statement correctly, that we should, or that there are serious plans to think of or conceive of or found a tribunal or a court to condemn the crime of aggression? Is this sort of the last stop that we are headed as an international law community towards the just war paradigm, as in a court should be able to punish all instances of aggression globally? There's contrasts with other international lawyers that have opted to or have made the plea for a more realistic international law, and that take the recent sort of bouts of violence as evidence that we should not be thinking of punishing aggression, but opening up international law towards a more realistic way of looking at war and the laws of war. Thank you.
I think it's a really excellent question. Just to be clear, I am not starry-eyed about even my own ideas. I don't for a single moment think that creating a special tribunal for the crime of aggression is somehow going to make everyone say, oh, okay, we give up. Not at all. I think it's about identifying what your values are and articulating them in a coherent and principled way, and being then ready to subject them to yourself, which of course our own countries are not willing to do. So I don't for a single moment imagine, that courts are the be-all or the end-all, just as they're not the be-all or the end-all in the domestic context. I mean, look what's happening in the United States right now. It seems that there is an inverse relationship between the number of, or at least a connected relationship between the number of times you're indicted for criminality and your popularity in certain opinion polls. So I think that the game for international lawyers has to be to recognize the limitations of their own discipline, which I fully recognize, and imagine for the long run what kind of system you could imagine over the longer term. So the International Criminal Court only has jurisdiction over 2/3 of the world, but none of the big powers. The United States is not a party, Russia's not a party, China's not a party. And so one has to imagine the moment in 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, where things evolve and how they evolve. And I truly do believe that the experience in domestic legal orders is analogous. Herschel-Lauterpacht wrote about that. And if you sit with someone like John Baker and look at how the courts operated in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries in England, it's not that different. I mean, loads of people were excluded from the jurisdiction of the courts. There was no jurisdiction over the crown in this country until 1947. So, the idea that justice is selective is not unknown to a domestic legal order. And I think the two are not identical. Obviously, they're not identical, domestic law and international. I'm not for a moment saying that. But what I'm saying is that in moments like now, you've got to adopt an incrementalist approach. That the best is the enemy of the good. And it's one tiny step at a time. And that's all we can possibly hope for. And that is the way to go. But I would say, and I thought it was the way that you were going, is that if you look at the history of international law over the last 200 years, you need a catastrophe to bring down the order with much mayhem and death, and then there is a rebuilding, and then another catastrophe, and more death and mayhem, and then another rebuilding, and that's how it will be. We won't be able to amend the system. We will bring it down, we will heap disaster upon ourselves, and then we will rebuild. But every time there's an act of rebuilding thus far, it has always sought to take what came before and make it better, quote unquote. And I think that's what's going to happen again. The only question now is the nature of the disaster, how many people are harmed by that disaster, and who's then in charge of the rebuilding, because that will have a profound effect. But in that sense, it's not possible to be very optimistic for the short term whilst retaining a degree of optimism for the longer term. In the short term, I think it'll be catastrophic, and then there'll be a rebuilding. And the crucial question is, who's in charge of the rebuilding?
Can I take a question from online? You spoke about laws against genocide. What about laws about ecocide?
So I've always had a big interest in the environment, as I explained. I described my Margaret Thatcher moment in 1990. And my interest has continued. And about 2.5 years ago, I was asked to co-chair an international panel with the mandate to come up with a definition of a fifth international crime, the crime of ecocide. So I've mentioned the 4 international crimes that exist. They're all completely anthropocentric. They're all about the protection and well-being of the human. And there is a gap in the international legal order. Just as in 1986, when Chernobyl happened, there was no such thing as international environmental law, so today there are no international crimes, in essence, which have the objective of protecting the environment as an end in itself. There's some laws which prohibit us from using the environment as a method and mean of warfare, but the entire thrust is to protecting human beings. And the group that I had the privilege of co-chairing with a very distinguished jurist from Senegal we were consensual, and we came up with a definition which is now beginning to run. Belgium has just become the first country to take our definition and implement it in domestic law, more or less our definition, slight variation, but pretty much the same. And the idea is that harm to the environment should be criminalized when it's on a systematic and massive scale as an end in itself and not merely as an end to protect the human. And for me, the inspiration for that, for the law students who are here, I still say the very best law review article I've ever read was published in 1972 in the University of Southern California Law Review by a wonderful American scholar called Christopher Stone. And he posited the idea in the title of his article, "Should Trees Have Standing?" The idea of rights for natural objects. And it seemed crazy in 1972, and it seemed crazy when I first came across it in the late 1980s. And yet it seems essentially right. And that was the proposal that we came up with. And the next stage will be to amend the Statute of Rome, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, and incorporate a provision protecting the environment as an end in itself. And I'm 100% sure that will happen. I don't know when it will happen. The reason I think that it will happen for the younger people in the audience, I'm lucky with the stuff that I do. I think a lot of it's pretty interesting and I enjoy it and, I'm motivated. But like any normal family, my kids are pretty disrespectful about the boring stuff that I do, except for Ecocide. It was completely fascinating. So The Guardian ran a story about this new group trying to define ecocide, and it was the first time in the history of my life that all 3 of our kids WhatsApped me and said, "Oh, Dad, finally you're doing something useful." And I thought that was interesting because what it said to me was that they really care. And that is where you need to, for the younger people in the room, that's where you've got to put your energies. That's the next stage. That's the transformation of taking us out of being the center of gravity of everything and realizing that there's something else that is bigger than us that needs to be protected for itself, but also if we are to have a space in which we can prosper and survive.
Thank you. Any more questions over here? There's one over in that corner.
And one over there.
Yeah. This side's allowed to ask as well.
Thank you for a very interesting talk that is understandable to somebody who's not a lawyer nor a historian. Taking a slightly different perspective, you've dealt with a lot of really very distressing, difficult circumstances, and I wondered how you and your colleagues look after your own mental health.
2 answers to that. 1, I was for an extended period in psychoanalysis, which I can recommend to everybody. It's not popular to say in England because everyone's like, "Oh my God, we don't talk about those things." But actually it was great. And that allowed me to talk about a lot of things that, were helpful. And secondly, I think it really turns on your family and your partner. And I'm incredibly lucky to have the most fantastic family and partner. And so you can just let off steam and be in a place where you feel completely comfortable and loved and easy. And I think if I didn't have that, it would be much, much more, life would be much, much more difficult. I mean, it is true that I have seen a lot of mass graves and dead people and awful things, and yet I'm definitely not broken by it, and I'm not a pessimistic person. And I think life is wonderful, painful but wonderful. And I think it's about the people that you have around you, and having a support group and a network and feeling loved and well. I mean, it might sound like a very trite thing, but in England I know people don't like talking about those things, like how loved you feel and so on and so forth. But actually it's true. I mean, that's actually what really matters in life. You know, right now it's a very intense period. Basically, I wake up in the morning and I'm juggling between negotiations on Chagos, because let's give the British government credit. Want to give a laugh? I'm going to give people a chance to have a laugh. Who was the British Prime Minister who changed 50 years of colonial policy on Chagos? Liz Truss. Liz Truss. In her 49 days, she changed the British government's position, and I think she's got to be given real credit for that. And there are now negotiations underway to resolve this matter on the basis of international law. So, you know, that's a really good thing, and that's a positive thing, but it's a lot of work, and it's, you know, occupying a huge amount of time. And then I jump from that, all in the space of this morning, to Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, and then you jump from that to Ukraine and creating a special tribunal for the crime. So it feels, oh my God, you know, how are we going to get through today? And then I've got to come and meet with Julian and talk to you guys. And, so the days are very full, and you just want to, you know, go home and watch Frasier with your wife and just let off some steam and feel good about life again. And I think that's how it is. I think those are the really important things. I mean, the advice I give to my students is just hook up with the right person and you'll be fine.
Can we take a question right at the back here?
Thank you. It's really about victims, witnesses, and their human testimonies. How important is that, and what can we do to make it better for them when they face not just fear of intimidation, but also being pilloried?
This is the issue of witnesses I'm really now very focused on. I've just finished the first draft of the third book in the sort of East-West Street Ratline series, and it's about Pinochet in London. And the proceedings, some of you will remember, when he was arrested and was incarcerated for a year and a half, and he claimed immunity for international crimes. And I had a bit part role in that, but it meant that I had a front row seat and got to watch the whole thing from close quarters. And Pinochet's life, unbelievably, literally, you couldn't invent this, intersects with one of the Nazis in the Ratline character called Otto Wächter's best friends, called Walter Rauff. Unbelievably, Augusto Pinochet was really good friends with the man who invented the mobile gas chambers and brought him to Chile in 1958. And they were mates. And so you have the sort of rat line spreading into South America in a way you could not just imagine. And so my book is about Pinochet in London and Walter Rauff in Patagonia. Many of you will have read Bruce Chatwin's book. You will have forgotten that Walter Rauff appears in chapter 95 of In Patagonia. It's almost unbelievable. There is a man in Patagonia. There is a man in Punta Arenas who hums German Lieder, blah, 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 blah. Really sort of incredible. And in the context of this book, I've I've spent 5 years trying to work out what Walter Ralph did or did not do in Chile between 1973 and 1977. And so I've spent a lot of time with agents of the secret police trying to work out what they saw and what they did. And in the research, I've encountered a remarkable man who was a school history teacher who swears black and blue that in August 1974, he was personally interrogated and tortured by this Nazi. Okay, so I have now flown to Chile 3 times to question him, re-question him, and thought a lot about your question. He has not budged. He's taken me to the room in which he says he was tortured, a place called Londres 38, right in the heart of Santiago. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about how I write this up in terms of, he's an absolutely lovely man who has never told his story to anyone in the same detail that he's told it to me. And I have a real responsibility to tell his story accurately and fairly, and to allow readers to form their own view about the veracity of what he said. And that is emblematic of the broader question that you are asking. And it comes back to a question actually about courts and tribunals and whether they are the best way to establish what the facts are. And to bring these two questions together, I would say that the function of a court and tribunal is not to punish as such, and not to prevent as such, but to allow stories to be told. And it is in the process of storytelling that you create a consciousness which, with a bit of luck over time, makes us a little bit nicer to each other. And so the witness's testimony and account becomes a central part in that process of storytelling. And I think we've given insufficient attention in the practice and function of international courts and tribunals to the role of the witness. And I can't give you a better answer than that, but I should be indicating to you I think about this a lot. How I treat this individual in this book goes to the heart of your question. And I'm very uncomfortable with the technique of examination and cross-examination and re-examination and trying to destroy, in this particular context, the character or the sense of veracity or probity of what an individual has said she or he saw. And so I'm grateful for the question because I'm thinking about it a lot. I don't have a simple answer.
I think there's a question right at the top there.
Hi. I was just wondering how it is that you actually enforce international law, because I know you mentioned that it's a long game, but I'm just not really sure what it entails with, for example, the Russia and Ukraine thing.
So the first thing to say, and it's a really important question, is that 99.9% of international law operates perfectly, and everyone complies with it. When you get on a plane and go on holiday to Malaga or wherever, your flights, the flight path, the communications, the booking of the tickets, all of that happens because of international treaties. And they work perfectly well, really, really well. They make the world go round. The food you've got at the local Sainsbury's, the use of internet, all of these things are premised on a network of international treaties, of international law. So the first thing to say is the vast amount of international law works perfectly well. It's the problem cases that you get up to. And again, to give an anecdote on how it works. So I mentioned that Liz Truss had changed the British government's position on Chagos. The decision of the International Court of Justice came in February 2019. Chagos belongs to Mauritius. The United Kingdom must leave forthwith. It goes to the General Assembly of the United Nations, which votes overwhelmingly. Just 4 countries support the United Kingdom and the United States against the resolution. 116 vote in favour. The United Kingdom must leave the Chagos archipelago by November 2019, and all the Chagosians can go back. So what does the British government do, or successive governments? They stick 2 fingers up at those rulings, at those decisions, and say, no, no, we believe in the rule of law, but not this bit of it. And nothing happens. They're going to tough it out because they're a superpower. And then I'd love to be able to say that it was the publication of The Last Colony, my book, in September 22, which changes everything, but it wasn't. It was the war in Ukraine, because the British government found itself in an impossible position, trying to persuade countries from the global south, in particular Africa, to support them in removing Russia from the illegal occupation of Ukraine, where the UK and the US are illegally occupying a part of Africa. That type of double standard does not go down well in the world, and that's why they changed the position. And so ultimately, the single biggest answer to your question is that it's not principle, it's not a policeman or policewoman or police person, it is self-interest that ultimately causes you to bring yourself into compliance with international rules when the price you're paying for not complying outweighs the benefits of not complying. We don't know when that will happen for Russia or how it will happen for Russia, but it will happen. We don't know how that will happen or when that will happen for China and the South China Seas arbitration, but it will happen. And it's the interplay between law and politics, and the politics of self-interest, that will determine the answer to that question. But at the end of the day, your example and the ones that I'm talking about are exceptions. Those Iraq, the huge exceptions, very significant exceptions to the general rule that most of it works really well, and there isn't an enforcement problem. And my own experience doing cases before the international courts, in pretty much every case bar 1 or 2, and I've done a lot, the rulings of international courts are complied with. There's no issues. Things get sorted out. So the experience that I've lived through myself is generally pretty positive. But it is the fact, as you rightly say, that we have these exceptional cases that cause us great grief. And we're living through another one right now on Israel and Palestine. And it's right that we should focus on those, but we shouldn't forget that they are exceptions rather than the general practice.
We're almost out of time. I do want to squeeze in another question from online, from a young, recently qualified solicitor who's is in a non-international law firm, but has increasingly concluded he's selected the wrong professional field. He'd like to make a career change to the international criminal bar. Do you have any recommendations on making such a change? How can he redeem his soul from...
No. I'm sure he or she is a fantastic person. And I think I got a question earlier. I did a session with a group of students from Corpus and Jesus. I think to transition in that way, you need a process of beefing up your international law credentials. And the best thing you can do is go off and do a specialist short course on international law, and do it at a place where the people who do the teaching are somehow involved in that world, and try to become a research assistant to one of those people, and that's how you get your foot in the door. But it is possible, and coming back to what we said right at the beginning, a lot of the people who get involved in the world of law and international law have career changes in their early 30s and suddenly decide that's what they want to do, and that's fine. That happens, that happens to a lot of people. Late career changes, even later than that. So it's never too late.
Fantastic. In which case, I think it just leaves to me to say thank you very much. We've talked about huge amount of things from your childhood and sport through
Charlie
to
George.
Charlie George, indeed, through to some of the most difficult times that we're going through at the moment. And I hope your optimism will be in the shorter term as well as in the longer term. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And that's it for tonight, but there's a lot more coming from us here at the Intellectual Forum. On Thursday, we have Emily Winslow talking about how to write a novel, something you clearly don't need to learn about. We're moving to South Asia and looking at the role of young women in policy in South Asia after that. We then have an event which actually looks at British history from the undertold perspectives of African Caribbean people. So very much something you talked about. We have the former speaker, John Burko, here to speak. We have Sheila Fitzpatrick, we have Elizabeth Rousing, we have Ross Atkins from the BBC, and much, much more. So I hope you will join us in person or online. Have a very good evening.